Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath. And today, we have a banger of a show. I'm super excited. Metztli, a 16-year-old from Denver, Colorado, is going to join us. Now, you might go, okay, why do we have a 16-year-old joining a therapist podcast? I'm glad you asked, because today we are going to look at therapy through the eyes of a teenager. What do teenagers really think about therapy? What might they be too afraid to tell us therapists or other adults about therapy? What practices should therapists consider adopting, and why should they do that? What are some of the issues that exist with current therapeutic practice through the eyes of teenagers? I mean, I could go on, but it's interesting because often we as therapists, we have a lot to say about what works for teenagers, but rarely do we ask teenagers themselves. And so I'm so happy, Metzli, that you are joining us to have this conversation. Would you mind saying a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm Metztli. I'm 16 years old and I'm soon to be a junior in high school. My dad is a counseling professor and I attend art school, so I'm slightly familiar with the field, yes.
Okay, you're slightly familiar, but I think you become more familiar
I
from talking
have,
to your
yes.
dad. Now, if I get this story wrong, Metzli, correct me, but you have actually written critiques of many of the various theoretical orientations of therapy that then your dad shares with his students. Is that right?
That is right. My dad just sort of was starting up to teach different counseling theories as a class, and I had expressed interest in wanting to learn about a few of them. And so every week we would sit down and he would go through his sort of outline for the class and sort of explain these theories to me. And then I would provide sort of my feedback and my thoughts on each theory.
What was this experience like? I mean, I know you can't in this, format talk about every theory, but I'm wondering as you started reading some of these, did you notice any common themes in your critiques or what you noticed about these theories?
I definitely started to see a pattern in which theories I enjoyed more. A lot of them, my dad would explain, these are a lot more like research based, or these have been definitely more just like theories and have not really been tested. And I found that I really lean towards theories that have been tested or have had like a different resource projects done on them. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so boy, that's a whole thing in our field too. Research and what constitutes research, et cetera. Man, I wish I would have had an experience like that as a student. And I've heard it's a big hit, by the way. I've heard all the students love you. Is that right? That's what your dad says.
That's what that's definitely what he said, and I would definitely receive feedback back from students, so he would come and, like, tell me, like, "This is what they're wondering about," or, "This is what they're hoping to hear more about," and I would be very excited because then I would, obviously wanna answer all of those questions and continue to provide my honest reviews on these theories.
Ooh, I love what you just said, honest reviews, and that's what I'm hoping for today is that we can just have an honest conversation, and it happens to be recorded on
Right.
something we call a podcast, but really we're just having a conversation, and I have some weird questions for you. I'm sort of famous for weird questions. Is it all right if I ask you some weird questions about
Of
therapeutic?
course.
Okay, so here's my first one. If you had to explain therapy to an alien who knows nothing about doesn't know what therapy is, but doesn't even know about like our civilization. But here's this thing, therapy, these two people that sit down there talking, whatever. So you're explaining therapy to an alien. What would you say?
I think the easiest way to start is to say that you're conversing with another person. So you're sort of intimately sharing these sort of feelings with someone else, whether that be something that's really hard for you to say or something that you don't tell other people necessarily. It's at its baseline, I think, to most people, it's a conversation with someone else.
Okay, that doesn't sound too scary. A conversation with somebody else. I've heard that you might be a little skeptical in some ways about therapy. Is it okay if we go in that direction? So what's there to be skeptical about a conversation?
I think a lot of the time therapy is not presented in that lens, which I find very funny because I think if it was sort of advertised as a conversation, you would get a lot more buy-in interest from other people, especially younger populations.
Okay, interesting. I would agree with you. It's not, in fact, I think therapists go out of their way to tell you about why this is more than just a conversation. But why? Okay. So, okay, let me ask you this. With teenagers, how is it advertised? Like when therapy comes up and you're talking to your friends about therapy, like what do they say? What do they make of it?
Well, I go to a very predominantly arts-based high school, so a lot of the people who attend my school and who I'm close friends with actually have very positive views of therapy. But to people who are the complete opposite and sort of oppose that, therapy is almost always seen as there you have a fundamental issue, and this is instead some sort of like treatment to solve that issue.
Ooh, okay. Yep. So the difference between a conversation and treatment to solve an issue. You're saying, I think, that if therapy tended to be more of a conversation and less treatment to solve an issue, that perhaps more teenagers would at least consider it?
I definitely think so. I think when you frame something as treatment, you're automatically assuming that, someone has a problem. And a lot of times for people to even admit that that's a reality or something that they face, it's really difficult. So even almost making it seem like it's a conversation and we're talking about maybe mutual problems or just things in general that like are hard for people. I think that makes it a lot more open and a lot less scary than here's a problem, this is treatment to fix that.
Yes, and you were saying that where you go to high school, actually a lot of your friends are into therapy, or I don't know if it's into therapy, but in therapy and open to therapy. Is it fair to say you're maybe a little more skeptical than some of your friends at school?
Definitely. Always seen therapy more through that lens of this is a treatment to fix something. And so I've always been very like hesitant to go down that road. But a lot of my really close friends actually have called their therapist like their best friend or have very, very good relationships with the idea of therapy.
Huh. That's interesting. So, okay, if a friend tells you, a friend at your school says, "Hey, I'm starting therapy," they might be excited about it or whatever. But what's your first thought when a friend tells you that they're starting therapy?
Well, unfortunately, my first thought whenever someone, says, I think I'm starting therapy or I'm really excited about doing this, I automatically assume it's like, oh, you have not been like emotionally well for a while, or there's some sort of issue that's happening with you where you feel the need to go into therapy. And so I've always sort of looked at it as there's something that's not right here, and that's why you're taking this path.
It must mean something's wrong and something like fairly significant. Do you think any of your friends go to therapy because just to be in conversation, or do they also understand it as something's wrong with me?
I think people definitely go to therapy nowadays as sort of just a way to keep their well-being just overall together. I mean, a lot of my friends don't necessarily have a huge, like, I don't know, problem that they're dealing with. Maybe it's just an overall thing. I compared it to just sort of keeping a journal, maybe almost, or having some sort of outlet to communicate. It's just to them like a way to have their, I don't know, feelings heard.
Let's get into, if it's all right, some of the ways that therapy may not be so useful. So I'll ask it this way. What's the cringiest thing a therapist has ever said or done, or that you think that they or imagine they might say or do?
I I really hate the whole like let me rank your feelings on a scale of 1 to 10. I think that's really, and maybe I'm in the wrong here, but I've had a lot of people tell me the same thing where it almost feels sort of hard or absurd to rank how you feel on a scale because feelings are so nuanced in that way that it's kind of hard to put them or, have them relate to a number.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Therapists do that a lot. They maybe they try to quantify that which is unquantifiable. And so, okay, so this is something that can be really cringy when you're asked to take something so nuanced like feelings and put it on a scale. Makes total sense. Anything else that you can think of that might be cringy that a therapist would do?
I think a lot of it stems from this idea that, like, okay, let's try to frame all of this through a positive lens. Like, that to me, I can't do, or sometimes, because sometimes I feel like there's issues where no matter how much we try to frame them positively, they're just negative. And so sometimes having to view something through a positive lens in order to try and like fix it or solve it to me seems pointless.
Ooh, yes, I definitely want to dive into that. So your sense is that sometimes therapists try to spin almost anything into something positive.
I think so, and what I always say is I feel like that's really diminishing a client's feelings almost, because you're sort of pushing this, "Let's think of this in a positive light. How can we turn this into a good thing?" when maybe it's not, and maybe it can't be.
Why do you think therapists do that? Why do they want to take something that maybe a young person is struggling with and spin it into something positive?
Well, and I think maybe this goes back to how this is marketed, right? Like, we're solving an issue here, right? So if we can spin this positively, or we can make this out to be a positive outcome, then we could more quickly solve an issue, or we can more quickly move on from the reason you might be in therapy.
Do you think parents also want an issue solved when their kids go to therapy?
I say this a lot, but I think there's definitely parents who are fixers and then parents who are more listeners. Sometimes parents want to fix an issue, right? And that's just kind of how they work. So I think part of going to therapy is that maybe you have parents who are fixers and who do just get an issue presented to them and immediately want to help you fix it, and maybe not help you understand it or listen to what you have to say.
Fixing versus listening and understanding. There's a theme developing there. How good do you think therapists are at fixing things?
I think inherently with therapy, it's flawed, right? Because we have an idea that therapists do fix issues, when maybe that's not what we should be aiming for in therapy. Maybe we should be aiming more for improvement, or even just like having those conversations, or listening, or just having that space where you can share those deep and intimate feelings. And maybe it's less of aiming to fix something.
See, what's interesting to me, I mean, I was once a teenager, but when I was a teenager, Metztli in the 90s, therapy was not so much a thing. Obviously, it existed, but I knew no one who was going to therapy, right? And so I think it's fair to say, from what you're saying, is like therapy is a thing now. Teenagers are aware of it. Many more teenagers talk about it and attend it. And so that seems like it can be a good thing. But I think so. I was a teenager once therapy wasn't a thing. I went go on through college, go through grad school, become a therapist. And I think therapists are taught that we're not fixers. And yet, it would seem that some of our theoretical orientations, some of what drives the work that we do, does attempt to fix those issues, right? Even though we're taught not to. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of a 16-year-old and thinking about therapy, and critiquing all of those theories that your dad teaches in his class. Do you get the sense that sometimes therapists say they're not fixers, but then actually get into the act of fixing once therapy starts?
Well, a lot of the processes, which I thought were really funny, were almost short term and very solution based, right? They were very oriented in, we are going to find a solution by the end of however long of a period it was. And I found that though I would support a lot of what these theories have to say, that would be sort of where I would pause and contemplate whether or not I could truly agree with it, because it seemed almost rushed to a conclusion.
Rushed, short term, quick fix. I mean, these are the sort of things I'm hearing. So, all right, let's say you come to see me as a client, I'm the therapist, right? And you get the sense that I'm trying to operate in a quick fix sort of way, that I'm trying to find a solution. What are you feeling as that's happening?
Well, I think I would feel even more anxious to go to therapy if I felt like my therapist was sort of rushing through my issues. I think I would feel the need to maybe not include as many details in what I was saying, or maybe even try to get to my point quicker. I think if we rush the process, then we're also rushing the results. And as such, maybe when you exit therapy, or if you do, right, it won't be necessarily as productive of an experience as it would have been having had a slower process or not feeling rushed.
So, one thing I'm hearing you say that sounds important is that perhaps therapists would benefit from slowing down.
Yeah, I think it would be. I think at its core, therapy could actually be really, I don't know, useful to everyone almost if it was framed in such a way as this is just one other thing you could like do and have around your life for a great duration of it. If you frame it in this more conversational, slower pace, sort of getting to know you fashion rather than here's a result, here's a problem we're eliminating, and we're going to do it in 2 months or a fixed time, and you're going to be in and out, and it's going to be great, right?
I actually think there'd be a decent number of therapists who would agree with what you're saying. Some that are, more solution focused, et cetera, may push back some. But I actually think most therapists aspire to something that you're saying right now, which is to slow down and to connect and to really give people time and space to dive in. And then, of course, there's these systems that exist, like the managed care systems, insurance, et cetera, that are like, hey, you get 5 sessions or you get 10 sessions that we'll pay for that are pushing back against this. But I actually think a decent number of therapists would agree that we do some of our best work when we slow down and when we have a conversation. All right. Now, let me ask you this. Imagine you're going to see a new therapist. Okay. Can you give me like a checklist of red flags? Like maybe you read their bio on the internet and then, you go through the first session. Are there any immediate red flags that would be on your checklist for a new therapist?
I think it definitely varies on the person. Like I've had so many friends tell me, "Oh, I've stopped seeing this therapist for reasons such as just our scheduling didn't work," up to someone else telling me they didn't like cats and so it wasn't going to work out. Um, so I think definitely for me it's very important that I get someone who either has a similar or the same sort of cultural background as me. I wouldn't feel as comfortable being with someone who was a different cultural background than me, or just not maybe, to put it bluntly, a majority in that sense, because I think there are fundamental experiences and a lot of things that can't be replicated by someone who is of a different cultural heritage to you. And so I think that's definitely something that I would prioritize in searching for a counselor or a therapist.
Yep. So I think, you can tell me if I have this wrong, just to say this as directly as we can. If you were to have a white therapist, right?
Right.
This you may not connect or the work may not feel as effective to you in particular ways. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And when I was learning about these theories, actually, a big focus is on feeling sort of the client's being absorbed in the client's experience. And one of my greatest critiques of that was I don't believe that someone who was white could ever feel the experience of a colored person in that sense, or in the same sense that a colored person could probably put themselves in the experiences of another colored person. So I definitely think that I would be very abrasive to going into therapy with someone who was white.
Okay, now imagine this, because sometimes the way these things go down, like I've worked with people in the criminal legal system, right, who are on probation, and sometimes there's like mandated sorts of therapies. So imagine we're speaking to a white therapist right now, and they hear what you just said. And by the way, I agree with you. Sometimes I take some flack in my own field for that, but I agree with you. But they're hearing this and they're going, okay, and they really want to process what it is you're saying. Like, what do you think white therapists should do with what it is that you just said?
I think a lot of it comes from maybe understanding that, yeah, I will never have the lived experience of a person of color. And having or accepting that doesn't necessarily mean I can't service or be a part of the person of color's therapy journey. I think that that definitely doesn't mean that I could never go see a white therapist, but I think it definitely means that I would prefer to see someone who has my same cultural heritage or is familiar with the experiences of a person of color.
And okay, so let's say that you are seeing a white therapist. What advice would you give that white therapist? Some of what I'm hearing is like some humility could go a long way because we have this unfortunate dynamic that exists in our field, just to call it out, which is that most therapists in the field are white and most are women. Most therapists are white women. Okay. And so, just statistically speaking, if any of us were to go see a therapist, we're most likely to see a white woman. Now, we have some work to do in the field in terms of how do we make our services more representative of the population, right? And so, this is like a larger systemic issue, one I take great interest in as an educator. And if you or me or anyone else was just gonna go, like, to an insurance panel or whatever and randomly have a therapist, it's most likely to be a white woman. So what I building off of what you just said, what do you tell that white woman that people like you and me would be most likely to see if we went to see a therapist?
Well, I think the automatic assumption is that because I've said this or because that's how I feel, it's automatically a thing that white women could not have that conversation. And I think that's wrong. A great, big, I have a large friend group who's actually primarily white women in their 50s that I love to talk to about a multitude of issues. So it's not necessarily a lack of you could never, we can never communicate. I think again, it's accepting that we are fundamentally different in this sense, or we have this difference where maybe you can't understand all of my experiences, but you're going into this conversation or you're going into this talking point with me, knowing that and knowing that we may have this experience, this different experience, we're going to acknowledge that, but we're also going to continue to work and find our similarities that we have, maybe, or continue to talk through, our issues collectively as we would, but with that caveat of we maybe not have, you can never fully understand, maybe.
Yep. This is really interesting to me. You said there are actually, some white women in your world in their 50s who you can have good conversations with. Is it okay if I ask you a little bit about, like, how does that dynamic take shape? Why are you able to have good conversations with them?
Well, what's funny is I say 50s, but it's more realistically 40s, late 40s, 50s, sort of.
Yeah.
But a large majority are actually moms on my brother's baseball team. So, which is weird, but we'll sit down and we'll have to, go to a multitude of baseball game months on end. So we're seeing each other, if not every weekend, every other day almost. And so, we have this, I don't know, joint factor where we, have this like collective thing that's uniting all of us, that's forcing us all to be there. But we've got this time to kill. We've got like this place in which we can just like talk about things mid inning or just like have these random conversations. Someone's getting married, someone's, kids acting up where, there's a huge age gap, between all of us. But I can still feel like I can converse with all of these women because I can understand some of their experiences with their children, or they can understand or relate to some of the experiences of a teenager back when they were teenagers. And so it really is, I think, or what we should be talking about with sort of age gaps in therapy is that connecting factor or that thing we can have in common.
Yes, I love this. And I think therapists spend a lot of time thinking about how to connect. And I do hear some therapists, especially I'm 45 years old, so especially as we get older, I think sometimes therapists that are in their 20s that are just starting out, I don't know that this is always true, by the way, but they feel like they can connect more readily with teenagers, right? But you're bringing up this idea of connection, which I think therapists think about a lot. How do I form a good connection? What's your understanding, especially maybe for that older therapist? Like, how what are the keys to forming that good connection with a teenager?
Well, I think you can still have a conversation regardless of age if you find that connecting factor. And that can be as interesting as one of my friends explained that she had a whole presentation made for her therapist on Pete the cat and her intense love for Pete the cat, where it had maybe been something where the therapist, who might have been from a different generation, might not have understood what that meant or who that might have been. But by crossing that gap, by explaining that passion or that thing that she enjoyed, they were able to then connect on that because the therapist now understands what this is. So I think it's definitely important to bridge that gap between generations or between topics maybe that the therapist might not be as familiar with than the client, and just have that explanation come into place.
So the idea of forming a connection first, really trying to understand the teenager rather than trying to jump in and solve some sort of problem or issue. Am I getting that right?
I think so. I think connection is really important. And I think a lot of the times we assume that just because, a teenager is in this weird, maybe social media haze where there's so many things that they're like really into, or all of these weird things that seem so foreign to someone who might not have grown up in that same time or with those same resources. And we automatically assume that sort of makes them unapproachable. When I think a lot of the times teenagers love to talk about themselves and love to be able to explain that to someone else. And so they're a lot more open to, yeah, maybe you don't understand what I'm talking about, but I have no issue explaining this all to you if you show genuine interest in it.
All right, I got to get some of the tea from you here because here's what therapists say about tea. Oh, they're on social media all the time. They're glued to, and by the way, I see therapists doing the same thing. 40-plus-year-old therapists always on their phone. But okay. Here, we'll ignore the hypocrisy. And they say, oh, these teenagers are just on their phone all the time. They're on social media. They don't talk to one another as human beings anymore. I mean, I hear all these stories that are being told by adults about teenagers in the modern world and social media and all of that. Like, can you give us some of the tea on what this is really like, to be 16 years old in this uh, current moment in time with social media and phones and all the things?
Well, I always preface that I may not be the greatest example because I'm not on any social medias really. But I think one of the really interesting patterns that I observed, I was asking sort of my colleagues and my friends sort of about these questions and what their thoughts were on it, is that the majority of my friends who do go to therapy and who have a positive lens of therapy are primarily on social media the most and have spent the most time on social media as opposed to the people who were off social media and were like, I've never stepped foot in a therapist office. And I thought that was very interesting and sort of showed, who are the people, maybe social media, sort of launches you into that path, or maybe it just makes therapy more approachable.
Okay, interesting. So many interesting things there. I often hear parents that are, as a therapist talking to parents of children and teenagers and even young adults who are wrestling with this notion of like, well, should I let my kid be on? Now, let is an interesting word because they may find their way onto it anyways. But the way they say it is, should I let my kid on social media? Should I not let my kid on social media? And I'm wondering, it sounds like by choice you're not on social media. And I'm wondering, maybe there are more young people like you who aren't on social media, but the story is just that everyone's on social media. But can I pry into that experience just a little bit to try to understand why you're not on social media? And maybe this social media thing's sort of overblown in some ways.
I definitely figured out it was more common than I had thought. Growing up, I was always very jealous of people who were on social media and this thought that, oh, I got such strict parents, right? I can't be on these apps. I wish I could. But I found, in high school that actually a lot of more people are off social media and it's a willing choice. And so I personally always say that, I haven't had the need for social media yet. I have feel like I can communicate and still make a lot of connections without having social media. And it is one of those things where even when I sort of experimented having it like for a job, I, had social media, it just made me like it made me very anxious and it almost, immediately drew me off of wanting to have it permanently.
Interesting. So sometimes I think another one of the things is that kids might feel left out if they're not on social media. Like, can you speak some to that? Have you ever had that experience of feeling left out or like you need to be on it to feel a social connection, a larger social connection?
I definitely have felt that before. I like to joke that I'm the personal photographer of all my friends because a lot of the time I am the person taking a lot of the pictures and then I don't realize that they then take them and they post them on all of their socials or and I find out later when they're just scrolling through their phone like offhandedly and I'm like, "Wait, that's my picture. Like how's that gotten on there?" And so I definitely felt like, oh, like I should totally like be on social media just to be able to tell like if my picture is being like showed around or like what if I don't look good or stuff like that. So I've definitely felt as though maybe it's something I am missing out on. But I think at the end of the day, I've been able to remedy that with, hey, like maybe if it is one of those things where it's like, could you just let me know if my picture is like if you're gonna use my picture on a post or let me have some sort of control over this. And I've actually found that I'm okay being hands off as long as I can sort of trust that it's my image or that the things that I have put out there, maybe on like a group chat or stuff like that, is still being respected.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, just the sort of social politics of navigating all of that and where these pictures go. And, my 13-year-old, she'll say, "Oh, I got clipped," or "We clipped someone," try to get, I didn't know what that meant. She taught me it's like you kind of get someone with a weird face or something, you clip them. I'm not expecting it. I thought, geez, these are things I certainly didn't have to deal with. Now, all right, let me ask you this. It sounds like you're saying there was a correlation, and I don't know, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but that there was a correlation between people who were more involved with social media and perhaps then seeking out or even necessitating therapy. Is that right? And if so, how do you understand that?
It was right, and I thought that was really, really interesting for a very long time. And it also so happened that they were participating in therapy, but they also had a much more positive view of therapy, which I thought was really, really interesting. And so I think maybe there's a correlation with maybe how therapy is spoken about in social media almost, or maybe if it's normalized even more within this larger sphere that maybe people who are off of those websites or are off of those platforms don't understand or aren't receiving.
Very interesting. What do you think are some of the messages that young people are receiving through social media about therapy?
Well, I think therapy just in itself is being incorporated into more conversations where maybe you're like, you maybe it's not necessarily being advertised as therapy, but just things like popular podcasts, right? We're seeing sort of this revival of podcasts, which is people having conversations with each other. And so even things like that, it's just sort of normalizing the idea of having conversations or having things that may be similar or akin to therapy. And so maybe that almost makes it much more normal or acceptable.
What's your sense, with the understanding that people are different, right? And not everyone views everything the same way, but in a general sense, what's your sense of how therapy is viewed by teenagers?
I think that there's definitely a stark divide between I almost feel like it is a spectrum, but there's two very different and opposing sides to it. I think then um, on one side, there's a really large acceptance of therapy and almost a normalization of it as less of a scary thing, of less of a sort of very different sort of thing. You're the weird kid because you're in therapy, right? It's almost normalized in a sense. Yeah, like I go to therapy and all of my friends go to therapy and we can just all sort of like talk and um share our different experiences on there. And I think there's a very polar opposite spectrum that's kind of like people who go to therapy have some sort of like fundamental issue, or there's a really weird thing where it's sort of like therapy seems like either too foreign to me or too scary to me that I want no part of it. Or maybe they're not nearly as educated on what therapy is, but it's definitely two very polar spectrums, I think.
You're pretty educated in what therapy is, and yet you remain pretty skeptical. Can you tell me about that?
I do, and I would encourage anyone, whether or not they're very skeptical or very, very open to therapy, to be more educated on why you are in that side or why you believe what you believe. I, again, have been very skeptical of therapy throughout the duration of my life, despite my father being in sort of this field. And what I always encourage people is that I can accept and know that maybe my position won't change, but I want to know why I do have that position or have evidence or some sort of uh, resources behind, what my viewpoint on therapy is.
Yeah, it's interesting too because we do this not just with therapy, but with a lot of things like, I don't know, like things that get worked with in therapy, like depression. We'll say depression, and we think that that means one thing. And yet, depression can manifest in many different ways for different people. And I realize that I'm doing the same thing with you here. I'm talking about therapy as though it's one thing, right? And therapy can represent very different things to different people. There can be different types of therapy. Would you say that, and I think you might have been saying this earlier in our conversation, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you say that there are types of therapy you'd be more open to and less skeptical of, and other types you'd be less open to and more skeptical of?
Definitely, and I also definitely think that varies by person. I mean, I was having a conversation with someone who said they did a lot of, like, exposure therapy, and that was really, really helpful to them, and as soon as I heard that, having, like, learned about that through my dad's theories, I was immediately put off and was like, "I would never be taking part of that," like, and that's an immediate no for me. But they actually spoke of it very, very positively and that it was really, really helpful to them. So I definitely think that w it's a good thing that there's such a variety in therapy and that maybe that should be advertised more, because if you can find sort of your perfect combination or something you'd be more open to, it's a lot easier to see yourself being in therapy, and I think that, again, that varies by person.
Yeah, I'm appreciating the open mindedness you have about different perspectives and people having different experiences. And now, the therapist in me has to ask this next question. I'm curious, what is it about exposure therapy in particular that you're like, nope, hard no for me?
Well, it was so funny when my dad was teaching me all of these theories, my automatic, I don't know, assumption was to imagine it happening to me. And so this is just a weird thing. I have a very big fear of frogs. And so when I heard exposure therapy, I imagined I'm being locked in a room with a bunch of frogs and I'm just going to be being left for dead because there's no way I'm coming out of that feeling okay. And so I was immediately like, never, I would not be in that position. But, when I was talking to this person, they suffer with very extreme OCD. And so the way that they were explaining it is they had a huge fear of vomiting. And so they would watch, or have their therapist would have them watch videos of different animals vomiting or things like that. And they would sort of get accustomed to this idea. And once they had said that, I felt, like, at ease almost, because I was like, "Oh, I immediately imagined they were gonna force you to throw up, or they were gonna sort of force this crazy, idea." And so I think, again, it's one of those things where when you become more educated on what the actual theory or the, therapy is in practice, it seems a lot less scary than it does on paper.
Mm, gosh, I appreciate that comment. And you said in practice, you highlighted in practice. Is it unfair for therapists and adults to be saying that they worry that a lot of the information young people get about therapy comes from social media, TikTok, et cetera? Do you think that's accurate, that that's where a lot of the information about, therapy is coming, or not? Are they getting it from other places?
I think it might be. I think, and also a big part of it is also how we see school counseling advertised. I think that that's definitely one of the primary ways in which I got sort of accustomed to what therapy was or what it was being advertised as. And I think those both differ, again, very drastically. So it might just be where you're getting that information.
You're talking about how therapy's advertised. If we put you in charge of creating an ad campaign for therapy, what sort of ad campaign would you create?
I think it's gonna be a lot focused on what sort of appeals to teenagers, and so I would immediately, the first thing I'm thinking is, let's call it a chat, or let's call it like a conversation, right? And let's have sort of these different conversations in different places. Like, here's a coffee shop, and here are two people talking about something, or here's, I don't know, a house or some different venues almost where we can normalize. Let's have therapy, but it's also not scary, like, blank wall room with one singular couch, one like chair facing the couch, and it sort of feels like a police interrogation almost, where there's the lights are all dimmed and there's one single spotlight on like a very worried face of an individual.
Oh gosh, that's such a good description. And unfortunately, this part's not so funny. Therapy sometimes can feel like an interrogation. Okay, so therapists might be listening to this and I think as a group, there are always exceptions. It seems therapists are really scared to get outside of their office. We're very rooted in sort of the idea you're talking about a couch and a chair sitting across from that couch, or in the modern day on Zoom or whatever it is. Are you saying that perhaps getting outside of the generalized, accepted, two people sitting in a room sort of therapy, if we were to move outside of that, that might appeal more to teenagers?
I definitely think so. And I think that's because it's demonstrated more in real life. Like, hey, me and my friend are going on a walk and we started talking about these really deep things. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that that can be a form of therapy where you're having those deep conversations with somebody else, but maybe it's not in that sort of format. The famous example I always use is that scene in Good Will Hunting where they're sitting at, a park bench and all of a sudden having this really deep conversation about what they're going to do with their lives, with this connection. And, it's very obvious that they are in therapy, but that they're being able to make this more accessible to other people.
And you're mentioning depth, and that makes me think of what we were talking about early in this conversation, is that sometimes when therapists go into problem-solving mode or whatever, it could lack a certain amount of depth. So you're talking about depth, and you're also, I think, talking about context, like where this conversation takes place, and that can matter. And just I mean, there is something about going into an office, I'm imagining especially as a teenager, I'm trying to think back to when I was a teenager. Again, therapy was not something that was, as popular back then, right? But as a teenager going in, sitting across from an adult in an office who's in some kind of suit or whatever they were, I mean, damn, that can feel a bit intimidating, at least as I imagine my teenage self.
I think it definitely is. And I think it's a really hard experience for a lot of people because, again, that sort of frames it as it's like going into a doctor's office, but you're knowing that there's a reason for you being there, right? It's not just like a daily checkup. And so it feels very intimidating to go in there and sort of have to be this vulnerable. And I think a lot of the times, yeah, maybe these conversations are just hard in general, but I think majority of people would say that I would rather have this conversation in an environment in which I'm more comfortable in rather than one where I feel really intimidated.
Okay, so we had someone on the podcast named Clayton Norman who does skateboarding therapy. He also does bird watching therapy, all sorts of interesting things. Do you think something now, obviously, if you don't skateboard, I don't skateboard. I mean, so skateboarding therapy is not going to work for me personally, but do you think that sort of idea is an interesting one or would be an interesting one to young people doing things outside of the office, activities, things that already young people are connecting with?
I definitely think so. And I think immediately I can see how a lot of therapists would be like, oh, well, I don't want to have to learn how to rock climb in order to be able to, communicate with my client. And my immediate response to that would be, well, maybe it's not something that's as scary as having to learn to do all these physical activities or all these crazy things. I would be open to like, let's go walk around a bookshop and talk about things, or maybe even just sit down at a cafe, right? So it's something where maybe it doesn't require you to have that many skills or that many crazy experiences with a client in order for you to still be able to do some sort form of therapy that's maybe different from your office.
Yeah, what I keep hearing coming through is like human. There's like a human interaction, like a genuine sort of human interaction, which I think therapists talk about a lot. But I wonder how if sometimes the way we've been taught to do this in office settings and formalized settings, it actually gets in the way of sort of a genuine humanity that I think is what I'm hearing you describe.
Definitely. And again, it comes down to let's make it a conversation. Let's make this genuine. Let's make this human, right? It's normal and more normal for people to have these in spaces and environments they're comfortable in. And whether that be, skateboarding or a bookstore, all of these variety of different things, that can be a lot more immediately accepted by teenagers and a lot more easily digested.
All right. Now, let me ask you, this one is a little more deep. I feel comfortable asking it because I can tell you can already go deep. But here's something I hear adults talk a lot about. For example, when there's something like a school shooting, right? They'll sort of say, and politicians and others will say this too, oh, well, it's a mental health issue, right? We just need to get all these kids in therapy. I mean, you go into the school every day as a student. So I'm wondering what you make of adults for things, like school shootings, for example, where they're saying, oh, well, it's a mental health issue. We just need to get them more therapy. I mean, are these politicians and adults on the right track? Are they on the wrong track? What do you think?
I can see where they're coming from sometimes. I think definitely a large part of a lot of really violent and really hard issues and things to talk about are very rooted in someone's mental well-being. But I also think that that almost becomes a scapegoat for a lot of these much deeper or even unrelated issues. A lot of these are can be traced to systemic issues that we're facing or different things where it's like, yeah, maybe if a school shooter had been in therapy, that would be solved. But I think that's almost too easy of a solution for or an excuse for what they've done. I think a lot of the times it's, we need to evaluate sort of how are our systems built? What are we prioritizing? And why is it that these things continue to happen, even with resources or when we claim that there are resources available for mental health?
Ooh, yeah, I really appreciate the nuance of your response there. I wonder what it's like as a 16-year-old when adults are sort of, and I know where you stand with solutions in therapy. That's kind of where we started, right? But I wonder what it feels like when adults seem to have all these solutions and they're sort of prescribing them almost down at you. What does that feel like as a 16-year-old?
Well, I mean, even just as simply as like your parents telling you to do a chore, right? You're more likely to have done the chore because you realize that like you would have to do the chore, so you're going to do it. But maybe just being reminded by a parent, hey, don't forget to do this, immediately makes you not want to do it more. So when you have more adults telling you, hey, we need to like get you in therapy. Hey, we need to do this thing. We need to make mental health more accessible by doing all of this different things, you're less likely to immediately be like, no, I don't want to do that. As opposed to if we sort of started this conversation around teenagers, what do you want to see in the mental health field? What do you want to see therapy being portrayed as? And maybe that would even make more people encouraged to be a part of that conversation.
Ugh. And this, for me, was the genesis of why I wanted to have this conversation with you, is because I wanted to hit. Now, granted, I understand you're one person, right? And so, you can't speak for everyone, but it seems to me that, and mental health is not alone in this, but many things in the sort of adult world make conclusions, prescribe solutions and actions about teenagers' lives without actually consulting with them, which seems dangerous.
I think it definitely is because unless you can directly relate to that experience, I mean, I guess the big sort of thing you could always say is like, oh, my daughter's a 16-year-old, so therefore I'm sort of the expert on that. And I think, have you discussed with your daughter those things? Right. And so I think one of the really important things is that now, my dad can go and say, like, here's things that like I hear the teenage population talking about, but this is because, these are my true like daughter's words, or these are my true experiences that I've received from a teenager. And so I think it's really important that even though it might still be an adult conveying the message or sort of leading the charge on some of these issues, do you still have the genuine perspective of teenagers or of that other population to sort of inform on a genuine opinion?
You don't have to talk about the particulars of the time you were struggling, but In a time in your life where you were feeling struggle and distress, what's a question you wish an adult would have asked you that they did not?
Oh, I think I a lot of it starts with just reaching out or asking sort of what's wrong. I think a lot of the times as teenagers, we almost feel sort of polarized or alone in our experiences. And it's really difficult to remember that our experiences can be relatable to others. Maybe, you know, others haven't struggled with the exact same issue that you have. But a lot of the times, if you take the time to sort of explain to an adult or to even just communicate how you feel to someone else, it can be more easily accepted by someone. So I think if an adult was to come to me, be like, take genuine interest in how I was doing, or ask me those types of questions, or just, general well-being check-ins, I think it would be a lot more easy for me to communicate with someone.
Yeah, there's that idea of it being genuine as well, and I'm getting the sense that some of what you were talking about, that you were skeptical about regarding therapy might have been, at least in part, because it didn't feel very genuine.
I always say that I prioritize honesty a lot. I appreciate when others are honest with me, and in return, I try to be as honest with others as I can be. And I think that a lot of times in the society that we live in, we're very accustomed to sort of this perfect vision, or sort of let's disregard the flaws in this. And I think it's really important to start having more honest connections, more honest conversations, and just open up the field to having honesty.
Yes, honest conversations. I mean, it sounds so simple, and yet so often we struggle to have honest conversations. We stay at the surface. We don't talk about sort of what's really happening, and we talk around things, and so honesty is one of those things that can sound really easy, but oftentimes in practice it's complicated. All right, I have two more questions I want to make sure I ask you before we're done. Okay. I have heard, again, adults, therapists, politicians, whomever, proposing that, well, teenagers and maybe even younger children should have therapy just like they do math class. They should go to therapy. It should be required, just like a class. I'm curious your thoughts about this. Do you think it's a good idea, a not so good idea? How do you think young people would react?
I think, at least for me, I think it's really important to keep that choice factor there. I think it's really important to continue to have a choice on whether or not you want to be in therapy, or whether or not you don't want to be in therapy. However, I do think that it would be really interesting, and at least for me, I think really important to have a space in which we talk about what therapy is. Again, I think I mentioned this earlier, is I think it's important to be educated, and so to be able to understand, this is why I have that belief about therapy. So I think maybe that if there was a way to have a class or an optional lecture on different theories, different, perspectives on it, that would actually be a lot more widely accepted than maybe like scheduled therapy on 8:20 in the morning every day or something like that.
I know I can imagine some answers to this, but I don't want to take it for granted. Why do you think choice is so important for a young person?
Because again, I think we talk a lot about how therapy is, or a teenager's perspective on therapy is almost always assumed or talked about by adults. And I think a great part that's really important is to have, a teenage perspective, a genuine, opinion. And so I think when you have that choice, you're getting a person's genuine perspective, genuine opinion on whether or not, they want to be in therapy, or whether or not they don't. And I think that's really important.
Unfortunately, we're getting near the end of our time. I could ask you like 20 more questions, but I'm going to ask just one more. What's one thing a therapist could do or say that would make you, Metzli, go, okay, I'll give this a shot?
I think it's about putting your clients at ease. So immediately, I think something that would really help is like, just to let you know, we can talk about, whatever you want or whatever, you don't want. I'm not There's no pressure, there's no expectation, and I think immediately just, again, having that reassurance, this is genuine, this is not forced, this is not rush, I think would really, really benefit a lot of teenagers and a lot of young folks who just sort of want to, like, have this reassurance that there's no expectation or necessity, behind maybe what is going on.
I have to ask one follow-up. I lied. I said it was gonna be the last question, but your answers are just so interesting to me. What do you think some of the expectations are, or at least some of the expectations that teenagers think often exist when they're going into therapy?
And I think we talk about this fast-pacedness, this solution to a problem, right? And I think that it's actually a lot more beneficial for a teenager to just have that option and have that, sort of ability to be like, hey, like, I'm here because I wanted to, or because I just, have this thing I want to talk about.
I so appreciate your presence today. I know you've been fighting a cough as we've been talking about this, and you're fighting through it, which I so appreciate. But your responses, I'll say, first of all, just for me personally, I've already learned a number of things that are immediately making me reconsider some of my own practices. Maybe you and I can talk some about that offline at some point. And I imagine some other folks that will listen to this will have the same experience. And I also really appreciate the spirit of the conversation because I felt like you were fair, you were thoughtful, and you were honest. Like sometimes I feel like there's this thing where if people are honest, then they're sort of like, well, take it or leave it, with that kind of attitude. Or they're too nice and then they don't tell any truth. And I just have to say, I really appreciate the way you showed up, which was like, you were honest, you had some truth to tell, and also you were thoughtful and nuanced. And gosh, I feel like a lot of adults struggle to strike that balance. And here you are at 16 doing that pretty readily when I'm asking you some pretty challenging questions. So, gosh, I'm so appreciative. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Having me.
Yes.
Thank you for having me. And, I just hope that this can help to show, therapists, teenagers are not that scary. We may look completely unapproachable, but truly we are a lot more human than maybe we're portrayed.
Mm, what a beautiful way to end the episode. Thanks so much, Metzli.
Thank you.